Two tribes are walking toward the same river. They didn't plan to meet. They just both needed water. One group carries spears tipped with volcanic glass. The other carries nets woven from plant fiber. Neither has seen the other's faces before. They stop. They stare. And then someone speaks. What happens next depends on one single invisible thing, something neither group can see, hear as a separate object, or hold in their hands. It depends on whether the sounds coming out of one mouth mean anything at all to the ears listening on the other side. Most of us assume the answer is simple. Human beings lived on the same continents, ate similar food, hunted similar animals. Surely, at some point, they all spoke some version of the same language. Surely two tribes a few days' walk apart could at least understand each other. They almost certainly could not. And the reason why is one of the strangest, fastest-moving forces in all of human history. Faster than evolution, faster than technology. A force that can turn one language into two completely different ones in less time than it takes a redwood tree to grow to full height. To understand what really happened when two ancient tribes met, you have to forget the idea that language spreads like a blanket, evenly, over a landscape. It didn't. It splintered, constantly, violently, almost from the moment humans started speaking. Here's the part that sounds impossible until you see the number. Papua New Guinea is a single country, roughly the size of California. It has fewer than 10 million people, and it is home to more than 840 living languages. Not dialects, languages using the same standard that separates English from German. That's over 10% of every language spoken on Earth, packed into one relatively small stretch of islands and mountains. How does that happen? The answer isn't mysterious once you understand how small human groups actually were. For almost all of human history, people didn't live in cities or even large villages. They lived in bands. Anthropologists studying hunter-gatherer societies have found something remarkably consistent across completely unrelated cultures on different continents. The tightly knit group that ate, slept, and moved together night after night usually numbered somewhere between 30 and 50 people. One level up from that, the wider circle of extended family and close allies, the people you'd recognize by name and face, topped out at around 150. This pattern shows up again and again in the anthropological record, so consistently that researchers gave it a name, the natural ceiling on a human group bound together by direct personal relationships, without the help of writing, ranks, or bureaucracy. Beyond that 150, you'd find the tribe, the wider population who happened to speak the same dialect. That number could run into the thousands, but it was already the outer edge. Beyond your tribe, you were in territory where the people might look similar, hunt the same animals, worship similar spirits, and still make sounds you had never heard strung together in that particular order before. Small, isolated groups, no written records, no recordings, no dictionaries, nothing to hold a language still. And language left alone does not hold still. It drifts, constantly. The way a boat drifts on water, even with no wind at all, just from the current beneath it. Every generation introduces tiny changes, a slightly different way a sound is pronounced, a phrase that becomes shortened out of habit, a word for an animal that stops being used because that animal moved somewhere else and instead gets repurposed to mean something completely different. None of these changes are noticed by the people making them. Each one feels invisible, natural, unremarkable, because compared to the generation just before, almost nothing changed at all. But changes compound, and once two groups stop talking to each other regularly, the drift in one group and the drift in the other stop canceling out. They start pointing in different directions. Linguists have actually measured how fast this happens. Look at the Romance languages: Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian. All of them came from a single source, spoken Latin. Not an ancient mysterious source either. People were literally speaking Latin on the streets of Rome. And yet, in only around 2,000 years, those languages drifted so far apart that a native Italian speaker and a native Romanian speaker today, listening to each other, understand only a fraction of what's being said. And a French speaker listening to Portuguese may understand almost nothing at all.
2,000 years to make an entirely new language out of one. Now imagine no written records at all, no printing press to freeze spelling in place, No schools enforcing a correct version. No recordings to compare against. That's the world every ancient tribe lived in. Linguists have found that under those conditions, a single spoken language can split into dialects, then into completely separate languages, sometimes within as little as a single 1,000 years, long enough for the descendants of the same ancestral tribe to become total strangers to each other, linguistically speaking, while still living on the same continent, sometimes the same valley. Which brings us back to the two tribes standing at the river. By the time modern humans had spread across the globe, tens of thousands of years had already passed since any shared ancestral language existed. Groups had split, and split again, and split again, each time drifting a little further from the group they broke away from. It wasn't like one language slowly filled up the world. It was like a single flame that kept multiplying into thousands of separate small fires, each one burning in its own direction, none of them touching the others long enough to merge back together. So when our two tribes meet at the river, the honest, most likely answer is, no. They probably could not understand each other. Not perfectly. Maybe not at all. But here's where the story gets more interesting, because understanding nothing and understanding everything were almost never the only two options. Languages rarely divide the world into clean, separate boxes sitting next to each other like countries on a map. Instead, they usually form something linguists call a dialect continuum, a long chain of neighboring groups where each community can understand the group directly next to them reasonably well, understand the next group after that a little less well, and by the time you get 5 or 6 tribes down the chain, the language is completely unrecognizable, even though every single link in that chain could talk to their immediate neighbor just fine. It's the linguistic version of a relay race. Nobody notices the baton changing hands right next to them. But by the 10th runner, you're not holding anything close to what the first runner started with. This means our two tribes at the river might have actually been in luck. If they lived close enough, in a continuous connected stretch of territory, there's a real chance they shared enough overlapping vocabulary, enough family resemblance in sound and rhythm to piece together a rough, clumsy version of each other's meaning. A gesture here, a shared root word there, enough to negotiate, trade, maybe even intermarry. But if either tribe had recently migrated in from somewhere else, crossed a mountain range, followed a coastline for generations, been pushed out by conflict or by a changing climate, the continuum would have already broken, and the two groups meeting at that river would be, linguistically, complete strangers. Every single sound meaningless to the other. Every gesture the only shared currency they had. There's an even older clue buried in one specific corner of the world. In southern Africa, a cluster of languages spoken by groups often called the San-Use click consonants, sounds made by pulling the tongue away from the roof of the mouth or the teeth, producing a sharp pop that doesn't exist in most of the world's other languages at all. Genetic studies consistently place San populations among the oldest, continuously distinct lineages of modern humans on Earth, branching off earlier than almost any other group alive today. Their languages are just as old and just as fractured. Several of these click languages are not closely related to each other, despite existing side by side for thousands of years in populations that are themselves genetically close. If any region should show what language looked like nearest to its origin, this is it. And what it shows isn't one shared ancestral tongue. It shows exactly the same pattern as everywhere else, small groups, drifting apart, again and again, almost from the very beginning. This actually explains something that seems strange at first. Multilingualism, not monolingualism, was probably the ancient normal. Anthropologists studying societies that still maintain something close to a traditional structure, small tribal groups, especially in places like Papua New Guinea, the Amazon basin, and parts of Aboriginal Australia, have repeatedly found that most adults speak several completely unrelated languages fluently, simply because their nearest neighbors don't speak their language, and trade, marriage, and peace all depend on being able to cross that gap. Being monolingual in that world wasn't the default. It was almost a disadvantage. And when the dialect continuum broke completely, when two groups had no shared vocabulary at all, but still needed to encounter. The engine that once multiplied one language into thousands is now running in reverse. The same forces that once kept groups isolated, distance, geography, lack of contact, are being erased by roads, by radio, by phones, by the same glowing screen sitting in your pocket right now. Every dominant language that spreads is, in a very real sense, doing to smaller languages exactly what isolation once did in the opposite direction. Except now, instead of splitting one language into many, contact is quietly folding many languages back into one. So think again about those two tribes standing at the river, close enough to smell each other's fires, unable to be certain whether the sounds coming from the other side mean friend or enemy, food or danger. That tiny, fragile gap between them, that moment of not knowing whether you can be understood at all, might be one of the oldest and most universal human experiences there is. Every single language spoken today, every dialect, every accent that makes you smile or makes you pause, traces back through an unbroken chain of exactly that same uncertainty, repeated at riverbanks and mountain passes and coastlines for tens of thousands of years, by people who had no way of knowing that thousands of generations later, their tiny drift in pronunciation would still be echoing in the way you speak right now. The tribes at the river never found out what English or Chinese or Arabic or Spanish would one day become. They only knew the sound in front of them, and whether it meant something or nothing at all. And in a way, that same quiet uncertainty is still happening every single day, just at a smaller scale. Every time you meet someone whose accent is unfamiliar, every time a word doesn't quite translate, every time you realize that even people who technically speak the same language as you don't always mean the same thing by it. The river is still there. It just looks a little different now.